Hey friends, tonight we are diving into one of history's most unusual and surprisingly sudsy urban disasters. Imagine your street not flooded with rainwater or a burst water main, but with a literal tsunami of dark, frothy beer cascading through alleyways, smashing into buildings, and generally causing a sticky, chaotic mess. That's the rather bizarre and ultimately tragic event we're uncorking tonight, the London beer flood of 1814. You're probably thinking, a flood of beer? Sounds like a party gone wrong. And while some initial, ill advised reactions might have leaned that way, let's be honest, dropped into the path of a 15-foot wave of fermenting porter weighing hundreds of tons, collapsing brick walls, and flooding basement homes in a 19th century slum, you probably wouldn't survive the sheer destructive force or the subsequent, rather unhygienic aftermath. It makes spilling your pint at the pub seem like a very minor infraction indeed. So before you get too comfortable, go ahead and take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're all tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below. Now turn off your lights, turn on your fan for some gentle white noise, and let's begin tonight's journey. You find yourself in London in the year 1814. The city is a sprawling, heaving metropolis, the heart of a burgeoning empire. The Napoleonic Wars are nearing their end, but for many Londoners, daily life is a struggle. Our focus is a particularly impoverished and overcrowded neighborhood known as the St. Giles Rookery. Imagine narrow, unpaved streets, poorly built tenement houses crammed close together, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke, uncollected refuse, and the general miasma of urban poverty. It's a place where families live in cramped basement dwellings, often in dire conditions, their lives playing out in the shadows of the grander, more prosperous parts of the city. It's a stark contrast, this world of desperate survival existing cheek by jowl with the wealth and power of early 19th century London. Looming over this very neighborhood, on Tottenham Court Road, stands a prominent landmark, the Moo and Company Brewery, also known as the Horseshoe Brewery. This isn't some small craft brewery. It's one of London's largest producers of porter, a dark, strong, and incredibly popular beer at the time. You can picture the brewery, a hive of activity, with drays pulled by sturdy horses constantly coming and going, delivering barrels of porter to pubs and taverns across the city. The air around it would be filled with the malty, yeasty aroma of brewing, a scent that for some might mean employment, and for others, just another reminder of the industry that dominated their environment. A mainstream historical fact is that Moo's Brewery was famous for its gigantic porter vats. These were colossal wooden casks, some holding hundreds of thousands of gallons of fermenting beer, towering structures that were a testament to the scale of industrial brewing in the era. Inside the brewery, on the afternoon of October 17th, 1814, it's a seemingly ordinary working day. One of these enormous vats, standing some 22 feet tall, is nearly full, containing over 135,000 imperial gallons. That's well over 1 million pints of porter, patiently maturing, the brew getting ready to quench the thirst of Londoners. This particular vat is held together by massive iron hoops, straining under the immense pressure of the vast quantity of liquid within. You can almost hear the faint creaks and groans of the wood, the constant subtle tension of so much beer contained. Perhaps a brewery worker, a storehouse clerk named George Crick, is going about his duties, checking gauges, making notes, the routine of the day lulling any sense of impending doom. One quirky detail is that porter was often aged for many months, even up to a year, in these huge vats to develop its characteristic flavor. This long maturation period meant these vats were constantly holding vast, heavy quantities of beer for extended periods. Sometime around 4:30 in the afternoon, something goes catastrophically wrong. One of the massive iron hoops around this particular vat, perhaps weakened by rust or the relentless pressure, suddenly snaps, then another and another. You can imagine the sickening sound of rending metal, the groaning of stressed timber. George Crick, the clerk, likely hears these ominous noises. He might have even noticed a problem with one of the hoops earlier in the day, but perhaps it wasn't deemed critical or a repair was scheduled for later. Historians still debate the exact sequence of failures and whether earlier warning signs were missed or misinterpreted. But what happens next is swift and terrifying. The vat doesn't just leak, it ruptures with explosive force. The immense pressure is released in an instant, and a tidal wave of dark, frothy, fermenting porter, hundreds of tons of it, bursts forth, a sudsy deluge of unimaginable power, ready to pour out of the brewery and into the unsuspecting streets and homes of St. Giles. The quiet routine of the brewery is shattered by a roar, and the London beer flood is about to begin. The catastrophic failure of that colossal porter vat at Muse Brewery isn't just a simple leak. It's an explosive decompression of immense force. You can imagine the scene within the brewery walls in those first few chaotic moments. The snapping of the iron hoops is like cannon fire, echoing through the vast storerooms. Then, with a sound like thunder, the 22-foot-high wooden cask, holding over 1,000,000 pints of beer, gives way entirely. The sheer weight and pressure of the porter, suddenly unleashed, is like a solid battering ram. A torrent of dark, fermenting liquid, mixed with splintered timbers and twisted iron hoops, smashes through the brewery's rear brick wall, which is reportedly 2.5 bricks thick, as if it were made of paper. The air is instantly filled with the overwhelming, sickly sweet, malty aroma of porter, and the roar of the escaping beer is deafening. But the disaster doesn't stop there. The initial rupture creates a devastating domino effect. The force of the exploding vat and the sheer volume of liquid suddenly displaced slams into other nearby casks and storage containers in the brewery. A mainstream historical fact is that several other large vats of porter, though perhaps not as colossal as the first, were also damaged or knocked off their foundations, adding their contents to the burgeoning flood. It's a chain reaction of destruction, a brewery imploding under the weight of its own product. The total amount of beer unleashed is truly staggering. Estimates vary, but it's thought to be somewhere between 128,000 and 323,000 imperial gallons. To put that in perspective, that's enough to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool, or at least a very significant portion of one, with dark, frothy ale. You can almost feel the ground shake as this brown tide bursts from the brewery. For the workers inside the brewery at that moment, it's a scene of terror and pandemonium. Some are fortunate enough to scramble to safety, perhaps climbing onto higher structures or escaping through other exits. But others are caught in the initial deluge. You can picture the desperate struggle against the powerful current of beer, the treacherous footing amidst debris, the overwhelming fumes. The brewery yard itself becomes a churning lake of porter, several feet deep in places. One quirky and rather grim detail that emerges from contemporary accounts is the sheer stickiness and cloying nature of the porter. This wasn't like a flood of clear water. It was a thick, viscous liquid that would have coated everything, making escape even more difficult. Imagine trying to wade or swim through a waist-deep river of lukewarm, fermenting stout. It's a uniquely unpleasant and dangerous scenario. The focus now shifts to where this enormous volume of beer is going. The brewery is located on Tottenham Court Road, but the breach in its rear wall faces directly onto the impoverished Saint. Giles Rookery, specifically an area of densely packed houses and tenements on New Street and George Street. This is where the full destructive power of the beer tsunami is about to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting civilian population. You can imagine the terrifying sight from those narrow streets. A dark, foaming wave, perhaps 15 feet high at its peak as it first bursts from the brewery, carrying with it bricks, its timber, and the debris of the shattered vats, roaring towards the flimsy dwellings of the poor. There's no warning, no time to evacuate. The quiet, grimy routine of a London afternoon is about to be shattered by a disaster as bizarre as it is tragic. Historians still debate the exact fluid dynamics of the event. How quickly did the wave lose its initial height and force as it spread? How far did it ultimately travel? But there's no doubt about its immediate, localized devastation. The beer, driven by gravity and the sheer volume behind it, pours into the low-lying streets, alleys, and most devastatingly into the basement dwellings, where many of St. Giles's poorest residents lived. You can feel the impending doom, the sense of an unstoppable force about to collide with a vulnerable community. The slow, patient process of brewing that porter over many months has culminated in a few moments of terrifying, destructive release. The Horseshoe Brewery, a symbol of London's industrial might, has just become the source of a very unfortunate and very alcoholic natural disaster. The torrent of porter, having burst through the brewery's back wall, now crashes into the unsuspecting heart of the St. Giles Rookery. You are there, in the narrow, crowded confines of New Street or George Street, perhaps going about your daily business, or huddled inside one of the poorly constructed tenement houses. The first indication of disaster is likely a sound, a deep, rumbling roar, like a sudden, violent thunderstorm growing rapidly closer. Then, before anyone can truly comprehend what is happening, the wave hits. It's a dark, churning mass of beer, 15 feet high in its initial surge, carrying with it the debris of the brewery wall, bricks, timbers, splintered vat staves, and the overwhelming, pungent, sickly sweet aroma of thousands of gallons of porter. The force is devastating. You can imagine the flimsy walls of the tenements, many of them already dilapidated, simply crumbling under the impact of this liquid battering ram. Houses are shunted off their foundations, their lower floors and basements instantly inundated. The sound of splintering wood, collapsing brickwork, and perhaps the terrified cries of people caught unawares fills the air, momentarily drowning out the roar of the flood itself. A mainstream historical fact is that several houses were severely damaged or completely destroyed by the force of the beer wave. This wasn't just a gentle lapping, it was a violent, destructive torrent. For the residents, especially those living in basement apartments, common in these impoverished areas, the situation is dire. The beer pours down into these subterranean dwellings with terrifying speed, filling them in minutes, trapping anyone unable to escape. You can picture the sudden darkness as the wave blocks out the meager light, the desperate scramble for an exit in the rising, suffocating tide of porter. The air itself becomes thick with alcoholic fumes, making breathing difficult, adding another layer of peril to the already chaotic scene. It's a uniquely nightmarish scenario to be facing a flood, not of water, but of strong, dark beer in your own home. It's the kind of bizarre catastrophe you couldn't make up, yet it's all too real for the unfortunate inhabitants of St. Giles. Is that beer coming under the door and through the walls? And, oh dear, there goes the wall. The initial reaction of those on the street who are not immediately swept away is likely one of utter disbelief and confusion. What is this dark, foaming liquid surging through their neighborhood? Where has it come from? Is it a burst sewer? A bizarre act of nature? The idea that it's beer from the massive brewery nearby might take a few moments to register amidst the chaos and terror. One quirky, though tragic, aspect of such an unusual disaster is the initial disorientation it must have caused. People are used to floods of water, but a flood of porter is outside anyone's experience. Historians still debate the exact reach and depth of the flood in its initial stages. How far did that first powerful wave travel before it began to spread out and slow down? But for those living in the immediate vicinity of the brewery's breached wall, in the low-lying cellars and ground floors of New Street and the surrounding courts and alleys, the impact is catastrophic. You can feel the cold, sticky liquid soaking everything, the reek of alcohol permeating the air, the desperate struggle for survival in the face of this most unexpected and unwelcome deluge. The quiet, miserable poverty of their daily lives has just been violently interrupted by a disaster born of industrial brewing, a dark tide that threatens to swallow them whole. The scene is one of utter devastation and bewilderment, a Sudsy apocalypse unfolding in the heart of London. The initial shockwave of porter and debris has passed, but now the true horror of the London beer flood begins to unfold in the cramped, impoverished streets of the St. Giles Rookery. You find yourself amidst a scene of unimaginable chaos and devastation. The narrow alleyways and courts are awash with a dark, sticky, and dangerously deep river of beer. The overwhelming, sickly sweet and alcoholic aroma hangs heavy in the air, mingling with the dust from collapsed buildings and the cries of the injured and terrified. This isn't just a mess, it's a life-threatening disaster unfolding in one of London's most vulnerable neighborhoods. The primary danger is, of course, drowning. The beer, several feet deep in many places, has surged into low-lying homes, particularly the basement dwellings where so many families lived. You can picture the desperate struggles in the darkness as the porter rapidly fills these subterranean rooms, leaving little chance for escape. Furniture is overturned, floating in the malty tide. People are trapped, their cries for help perhaps lost in the general pandemonium or muffled by the thick liquid. A mainstream historical fact is that 8 people, all women and children, officially lost their lives as a direct result of the London beer flood. The victims were predominantly from the Irish immigrant community that populated much of the St. Giles Rookery. One of the most tragic and frequently recounted stories is that of a wake being held for a young boy, John Saville, in a basement room in New Street. Mourners, including the boy's mother, Anne Saville, and several other women and children, were gathered to pay their respects when the beer flood struck. You can imagine the sudden horror as the room was inundated. The wave of porter burst in, extinguishing candles, plunging the mourners into darkness, and rapidly filling the confined space. 4 people at this wake alone perished: Anne Saville herself, and 3 other women, Mary Mulvey, and her young son, Thomas Murray, also died there, or was counted as a separate death directly related to the wake's location: Hannah Bamfield and Eleanor Gannon. It's a scene of almost unimaginable tragedy, a gathering for mourning turned into a new, horrific catastrophe. Beyond drowning, the sheer force of the beer wave caused buildings to collapse, crushing unfortunate victims. Young Sarah Bates, a girl of only 3 years old, was reportedly killed when the wall of her house gave way. The weight of hundreds of tons of liquid, moving with considerable speed, acted like a demolition crew on the already poorly constructed tenements. You can almost hear the groan and crack of timber, the sudden, terrifying rumble of falling brickwork. Another victim, Mary Banfield, a mother and her young daughter, were also caught by the flood and its destructive force. One quirky, though utterly grim detail is that some initial reports and later legends suggested that the alcoholic fumes themselves were a danger capable of overcoming people. While the primary cause of death for most victims was drowning or trauma from collapsing structures, the potent concentrated smell of so much fermenting beer in confined spaces certainly wouldn't have helped those struggling for air. It's like being trapped in the world's largest, most aggressive, and least fun pub during a demolition. Historians still debate the exact number of unrecorded or indirect casualties. Given the chaotic nature of the event, the poverty of the area, and the rudimentary record keeping for the urban poor in 1814, is it possible that other deaths went unattributed to the flood, or that some victims were simply never found or identified? The official death toll is 8, but the true human cost in terms of injury, displacement, and long-term health effects for the survivors in this already marginalized community was likely much higher. You can feel the desperation of those moments, people clinging to floating debris, trying to pull loved ones from the rising tide of porter, the sounds of terror and grief echoing through the beer-drenched streets. It was a disaster unique in its composition, but all too familiar in its tragic impact on the poorest and most vulnerable. As the initial, violent surge of the great beer wave subsides, you are left surveying a scene of utter chaos and sodden devastation in the St. Giles Rookery. The narrow streets and courts are now shallow lakes of dark, sticky porter littered with debris, shattered timbers from the brewery vats, broken furniture from demolished homes, and the pathetic, sodden belongings of the residents. The air is thick with the potent, cloying stench of stale beer and damp, decaying plaster. You can imagine the eerie silence that might have descended in some areas, broken only by the groans of the injured, the cries of those searching for loved ones, or the ominous creak of still unstable buildings. Rescue efforts in these first chaotic hours are likely to be haphazard and driven by the community itself. There's no organized emergency service in the modern sense, no fleet of ambulances or fire brigades specifically trained for this kind of bizarre urban disaster. It's down to neighbors helping neighbors, individuals bravely wading into the beer-filled cellars and dangerously damaged buildings to pull out survivors or recover the dead. You can picture people using makeshift rafts or simply struggling through the viscous, waist-deep liquid, their clothes and skin saturated with porter. The darkness of the basements, the instability of the structures, and the overwhelming fumes would make any rescue attempt incredibly perilous. A mainstream historical fact is that despite the dangers, ordinary people did risk their lives to help others, a testament to human resilience, even in the face of such an absurd and terrifying catastrophe. Now, we come to one of the most enduring and perhaps sensationalized aspects of the London beer flood: the stories of people drinking the beer directly from the streets. You can almost see it. In the midst of the chaos and tragedy, some individuals, perhaps driven by a mixture of desperation, opportunism, or simply a very misguided notion of waste not, want not, reportedly began to scoop up the spilled porter in whatever containers they could find, or even drink it directly from the gutters. Accounts from the time and later embellishments paint a picture of a macabre drunken carnival unfolding amidst the wreckage. One particularly infamous, though likely apocryphal or exaggerated tale, is of hundreds of people partaking in this free-for-all, leading to mass intoxication and even deaths from alcohol poisoning in the days that followed, supposedly compounding the tragedy. It's the kind of story that makes you chuckle grimly. Only in London could a disaster involve people trying to drink their way through the floodwaters. Never let a good crisis or several 100,000 gallons of free beer go to waste, governor. However, historians and contemporary accounts offer a more nuanced picture. While it's plausible, even likely, that some individuals did try to salvage or consume the beer, this was an impoverished community, and porter was a valuable commodity. The extent of this mass public intoxication is often debated. Was it a widespread phenomenon, or a few isolated incidents that were later exaggerated for sensational effect? The official inquest records don't mention deaths from alcohol poisoning directly linked to drinking the flood beer, though such details might have been overlooked or unrecorded in the context of the more immediate deaths from drowning and trauma. It's also important to remember that the beer was likely contaminated with debris, filth from the streets, and whatever else it had picked up on its destructive journey. Drinking it would have been a very risky proposition, even for those with strong stomachs. What is certain is that the scene was one of profound misery and squalor. The beer, as it began to recede or soak into the ground, would have left behind a sticky, foul-smelling residue coating everything. Damaged buildings sagged precariously. Families were left homeless, their meager possessions destroyed. You can feel the despair setting in as the initial shock wears off and the full extent of the damage becomes clear. The authorities, such as they were for an area like St. Giles, would have been slow to respond, and their efforts likely focused more on maintaining order and clearing the streets than on providing immediate relief to the victims. For the residents of this forgotten corner of London, the Great Beer Flood was not just a bizarre anecdote. It was a genuine human tragedy, a sudden, sticky, and deeply unwelcome immersion in the consequences of industrial accident and urban poverty. The day after the Great Beer Flood, October 18th, 1814, dawns on a scene of sticky, smelly devastation in the St. Giles Rookery. You can imagine the residents emerging from whatever shelter they found, or perhaps still trapped in upper rooms, looking out onto a landscape transformed into a shallow, stinking lake of rapidly souring porter, mud, and debris. The initial shock might be giving way to a grim assessment of the damage, the loss of homes, belongings, and, for some, loved ones. The air is still thick with the pungent aroma of stale beer, a constant though inescapable reminder of the bizarre catastrophe. What about Moo and Company Brewery, the source of this alcoholic deluge? You can picture the scene there, utter chaos. The brewery yard itself would be a wreck, with collapsed vats, splintered timbers, and a significant loss of their valuable product. The owners and remaining workers are likely in a state of shock and frantic activity. Their immediate concern, beyond the human tragedy unfolding just outside their walls, would be the immense financial loss. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of porter, representing a fortune in potential sales, now lay wasted in the streets and cellars of St. Giles. A mainstream historical fact is that the brewery did suffer a substantial financial blow, though, as we'll see, they later managed to recoup some of it in a rather unexpected way. For now, however, their focus is likely on damage control within their own premises and perhaps a dawning awareness of the horror they've inadvertently unleashed upon their neighbors. The cleanup efforts in the St. Giles area would have been slow, disorganized, and largely left to the residents themselves in these initial stages. You don't see teams in hazmat suits with powerful pumps arriving. Instead, it's people with buckets and shovels trying to clear out their flooded basements, sifting through the debris for salvageable possessions. The parish authorities, perhaps the beadles and overseers of the poor for St. Giles, would eventually become involved, but their resources were limited, and their primary concern was often more about preventing public disorder and dealing with the dead than providing comprehensive aid to the survivors. One quirky detail is that for days after the flood, the area reportedly reeked so strongly of beer that it was almost overpowering. It's said that some people even complained of headaches and nausea simply from the fumes. It's like the world's worst brewery tour from which you can't escape. Yes, the dominant note is despair, with an undercurrent of impending typhus and a finish of utter ruin. Newspaper reports of the time, once word of this extraordinary event spread, would have likely focused on the sensational aspects, a river of beer, but also, one hopes, on the tragic loss of life and the destruction of property. You can imagine the headlines in the Times or the Morning Chronicle trying to convey the sheer unusualness of the disaster. A deluge of porter, 8 souls perish in unprecedented brewery accident. The initial accounts might have been confused, perhaps exaggerating some details, like the stories of mass drunkenness, while underestimating others. Historians still debate how the contemporary press portrayed the victims and the brewery. Was there immediate sympathy for the impoverished residents, or was there a tendency to blame them for their own predicament, or even to sensationalize their alleged attempts to drink the floodwaters? For the families directly affected, the immediate aftermath is a struggle for survival. Their homes are uninhabitable, their few possessions ruined. They are likely homeless, seeking shelter with friends or relatives, or in already overcrowded workhouses. The loss of life, particularly for those who saw family members drown in their own basements, is an unimaginable grief, compounded by the bizarre nature of the event. You can feel the raw human suffering beneath the strange, almost darkly comical surface of a beer flood. There's nothing funny about losing your child or your home to a tide of fermenting liquid. As the initial chaos subsides, the questions begin to mount. How could this have happened? Who was to blame? And what, if anything, would be done for the victims of this surprisingly sudsy street disaster? The smell of stale beer is not just an olfactory offense. It's the scent of tragedy and official neglect hanging over St. Giles. As the days turn into weeks following the Great London Beer Flood of October 1814, you see the St. Giles Rookery slowly, painfully, trying to recover, though recovery is perhaps too strong a word for a community already so deeply mired in poverty. The initial overwhelming stench of porter gradually fades, replaced by the more familiar, if still unpleasant, smells of urban squalor, now compounded by dampness and decay from the floodwaters. The immediate, chaotic aftermath gives way to a grim struggle for normalcy, or at least survival. Public reaction to this bizarre disaster, as news spread through London and beyond, was likely a mixture of horror, morbid curiosity, and perhaps for some in the more comfortable classes, a degree of detachment or even dark amusement at the sheer absurdity of a beer tsunami. You can imagine people in coffee houses and drawing rooms discussing the extraordinary occurrence at Mew's Brewery, the details perhaps becoming more lurid and exaggerated with each retelling. Ballad singers and street pamphleteers might have quickly capitalized on the event, producing sensationalized accounts or darkly comic songs about the deluge of porter and the drunkenness of St. Giles. A mainstream historical fact is that disasters in this period, especially unusual ones, often became fodder for popular entertainment and moralizing tracts. Charitable efforts for the victims, however, appear to have been limited and largely uncoordinated. This wasn't an era of well-organized disaster relief agencies or government-led aid programs in the way we understand them today. While individual acts of kindness or parish-level assistance undoubtedly occurred, there's little evidence of a large-scale, city-wide charitable response specifically for the beer flood sufferers. One rather grim and quirky detail that underscores the desperation of the affected families is that some reportedly exhibited the bodies of their deceased relatives laid out in their ruined homes, hoping to solicit coins from curious or sympathetic onlookers. It's a shocking practice to modern sensibilities, but it speaks volumes about the extreme poverty and lack of social safety nets at the time. It's like a macabre, real-life GoFundMe, born out of utter destitution. Spare a penny for the poor soul drowned in porter, sir? See the tragic sight for yourself. Meanwhile, at Mew and Company Brewery, the focus is on damage control, both literal and financial. The owners would have been assessing the structural damage to their premises, the loss of valuable equipment, and of course, the staggering loss of over 100,000 gallons of porter. You can picture them in hurried consultations with lawyers and insurers, if brewery vat explosions were even covered by insurance back then. Their public image was also at stake, while, as we'll see, they would largely escape legal blame. The very fact that their operations had caused such death and destruction in a neighboring community could not have been good for business. Historians still debate how effectively Moo and Company managed their public relations in the immediate aftermath. Did they express public remorse or offer direct assistance to the victims? Or was their primary concern their own financial recovery? The financial implications for the brewery were indeed significant. The loss of so much product was a huge blow. However, in a rather astonishing turn of events, the company later petitioned Parliament for a remission of the excise duty they had already paid on the vast quantity of beer that was lost in the flood. Essentially, they asked for a tax rebate on the beer that had inadvertently demolished a neighborhood and killed 8 people. You can almost hear the collective gasp of disbelief, or perhaps the weary sigh of cynicism. This petition would become a key part of the official aftermath, highlighting the stark contrast between the value placed on lost revenue for a major business versus the value placed on the lives and livelihoods of the impoverished residents of St. Giles. As the immediate chaos subsides and the cleanup, however rudimentary, continues, the formal process of inquiry begins. The coroner would be called to investigate the deaths, and an inquest would be held. You can feel the anticipation, the desire for answers, perhaps for justice, from the bereaved and the displaced. But what kind of justice could be expected when the perpetrator was not a person, but an exploding vat of beer, an act of God, as it would eventually be declared? The stage is being set for the official reckoning, a process that would reveal much about the attitudes towards industrial accidents, poverty, and corporate responsibility in early 19th century London. The suds have settled, but the bitterness remains. The immediate, sticky chaos of the London beer flood has somewhat subsided, leaving behind a devastated neighborhood and grieving families. Now, the official machinery of early 19th century justice, such as it is, begins to turn its attention to the matter. You can imagine the scene as a coroner's inquest is convened to formally investigate the 8 deaths that occurred in the St. Giles Rookery. This isn't a grand public inquiry by modern standards, but a more localized, though still significant, legal proceeding designed to determine the cause of death and, crucially, whether any blame could be assigned. The air in the room where the inquest is held, perhaps a crowded public house gorfa, Arabic for room, an anachronistic slip for a London pub, should be tap room or assembly room or a parish hall, is likely thick with a mixture of sorrow, lingering beer fumes, and a degree of public curiosity. Witnesses are called to give their testimony. You might see George Crick, the brewery storehouse clerk, who first noticed the failing iron hoop on the massive vat, nervously recounting the events of that afternoon. He would describe the ominous sounds, the sudden rupture, and the terrifying cascade of porter. Other brewery workers might testify about the state of the vats, the normal procedures for their maintenance, and whether there had been any prior warnings or concerns about their structural integrity. Their testimony would likely emphasize the sudden, unforeseeable nature of the Veredict's collapse. A mainstream historical fact is that the inquest heard evidence that the vats were well made and that the hoops were regularly inspected, though the precise thoroughness of these inspections might be debatable with hindsight. Then there are the residents of St. Giles, the survivors, perhaps some who lost family members. You can picture them, likely poor and unaccustomed to such formal proceedings, trying to articulate the horror of what they experienced, the sudden deluge, the collapsing walls, the desperate struggle in the dark, beer-filled basements. Their accounts would paint a vivid, tragic picture of the human cost of the disaster. However, their voices, representing the impoverished and often marginalized Irish immigrant community, might not have carried the same weight as those of the brewery owners or their employees in the eyes of the jury, which would have been composed of local tradesmen and property owners. The central question for the inquest is whether the deaths were accidental or if there was negligence on the part of Moo and Company Brewery. Could the disaster have been prevented? Were there obvious signs of danger that were ignored? One quirky detail, or perhaps a telling one, is that the concept of corporate manslaughter or widespread industrial safety regulations was virtually non-existent at this time. Accidents in factories, mines, and breweries, while tragic, were often seen as unfortunate but unavoidable consequences of industrial progress, or simply as acts of God. And indeed, after hearing the evidence, the coroner's jury returns its verdict. The 8 victims died casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. In essence, it was declared an act of God. No individual or company was held legally responsible for the deaths or the destruction. You can imagine the reaction to this verdict among the survivors and the bereaved in St. Giles, likely a sense of resignation, perhaps quiet anger, but with little power to challenge the outcome. Historians still debate whether this verdict was a fair reflection of the evidence presented at the time, given the prevailing legal and industrial standards, or if it represented a system that was inherently biased towards protecting business interests over the lives of the poor. Was it a genuine accident that no one could have reasonably foreseen with the knowledge of the day, or was it a catastrophic failure waiting to happen in an industry pushing the limits of its technology with these enormous vats? The Act of God verdict meant that Moo's and Company Brewery was absolved of any legal blame, and consequently was not required to pay any compensation to the victims' families or to those whose homes and livelihoods had been destroyed. The immense financial loss from the spilled beer was the brewery's primary concern, and as you know, they even successfully petitioned Parliament to waive the excise taxes on it, effectively getting a government rebate for their lost product. It's a stark illustration of where priorities lay. The families of St. Giles were left to pick up the pieces of their lives on their own, with little or no official aid. The Great Beer Flood had brought them tragedy and ruin, and the official response offered them no recompense, only a verdict that attributed their suffering to divine rather than human or corporate agency. The coroner's verdict of Act of God effectively closed the official chapter on the London beer flood of 1814, at least as far as legal culpability was concerned. Moo and Company Brewery, absolved of blame and even managing to recoup its lost excise duties, could now focus on repairing the damage to its premises and presumably brewing more porter. You can imagine the swift efforts to clear the wreckage within the brewery yard, to repair the breached wall, and perhaps to reconsider the structural integrity of their remaining colossal vats. Though whether this led to significant immediate changes in brewing technology or safety practices across the industry is debatable, one might expect such a bizarre and tragic industrial accident to spur immediate calls for new regulations, for stricter oversight of breweries and the massive containers they used. However, the early 19th century was not an era of stringent health and safety legislation as we know it. A mainstream historical fact is that the London beer flood did not lead to any significant, widespread reforms in brewing practices or the construction of vats. Large vats continued to be a feature of London breweries for many years. The Act of God verdict essentially framed it as an unforeseeable accident rather than a systemic failure requiring regulatory intervention. It's a bit like having a social media platform cause a massive data breach, and then everyone just shrugs and says, well, these things happen in cyberspace, don't they? And carries on. The real push for industrial safety reforms would come later in the 19th century, driven by an accumulation of many such tragedies across various industries. The Moo and Company Brewery itself rebuilt and continued to operate on the Tottenham Court Road site for over a century, a prominent London landmark. You can picture it, perhaps with new, hopefully stronger vats, its daily operations eventually returning to normal, the Great Beer Flood becoming a peculiar, perhaps slightly embarrassing episode in its corporate history. The brewery was eventually demolished in the early 20th century in 1922, and the Dominion Theatre now stands on part of the former brewery land. One quirky detail is that for many years, there was no prominent plaque or memorial on the site to commemorate the beer flood or its victims. It remained largely a curious footnote in London's history, a story whispered among locals or recounted by historians of the city's more unusual disasters. How is the London beer flood remembered today? It often occupies a strange space in popular historical accounts, a mixture of the tragic and the faintly absurd. The very idea of a fatal flood of beer has a kind of dark, almost Monty Python-esque humor to it, which can sometimes overshadow the genuine human suffering it caused. Historians still debate the most appropriate way to view the event. Is it primarily a bizarre anecdote, an example of weird history? Or is it a more serious lens through which to examine the dangerous industrial conditions of the early 19th century, the extreme poverty and vulnerability of the urban poor in places like the Saint, Giles Rookery, and the societal attitudes towards corporate responsibility and disaster relief at the time? The story certainly highlights the vast social chasm that existed in Georgian London, where a business could be compensated for its lost product, while the families of those who perished in the deluge received little or nothing. You can feel the layers of meaning in this strange event. On the surface, it's about a burst vat and a lot of spilled beer. But dig a little deeper, and it's about industrial scale, engineering limits or failures, the precariousness of life for the urban poor, and the often indifferent face of officialdom in the face of their suffering. The London beer flood serves as a potent reminder that even the most mundane of industries, brewing beer, can have unforeseen and devastating consequences when things go catastrophically wrong, especially when the human element, the well being of the surrounding community, is not a primary consideration. The sudsy streets of St. Giles that day were a testament to a particular moment in London's history, a city struggling with the rapid changes and often brutal realities of early industrialization. As we draw the bung on our story of the London beer flood, you're left contemplating more than just a bizarre historical anecdote. It's a curious, frothy lens through which to view the London of 1814, a city of stark contrasts, of burgeoning industry and grinding poverty, a city where the pursuit of profit could, quite literally, unleash a destructive torrent upon its most vulnerable inhabitants. The event, for all its strangeness, holds up a mirror to the social conditions, the technological hubris, and the nascent, often inadequate, understanding of risk and responsibility in an era teetering on the edge of massive industrial and social change. The London beer flood serves as a potent, if unusual, reminder of the inherent dangers of early industrialization. The Moo Brewery, with its colossal vats, was a marvel of its time, a symbol of the scale and ambition of British industry. But it also represented a concentration of immense potential energy, a stored force that, when catastrophically released, proved deadly. You can see it as a microcosm of the broader industrial landscape, where new technologies and larger scales of production often outpaced safety measures and an understanding of potential hazards. A mainstream historical fact is that the 19th century would see numerous other industrial accidents, mine explosions, factory fires, boiler failures, that would gradually lead to calls for greater regulation and worker protection. The beer flood was a particularly odd manifestation of this, but it fits into that larger narrative of a society grappling with the often unforeseen consequences of its own ingenuity and drive. The event also casts a harsh light on the social stratification of Georgian London. The St. Giles Rookery, the recipient of this unwanted deluge, was one of the city's most notorious slums, a place where life was already precarious, unhealthy, and short for many of its inhabitants. The floodwaters, indifferent to social standing, nevertheless found their most tragic purchase in the flimsy, overcrowded basement dwellings of the poor. The official response, the act of God verdict, the lack of compensation for victims, the brewery's successful claim for a tax rebate, underscores the often callous disregard for the suffering of the lower classes. It's a stark reminder that disasters, even bizarre ones, often impact the most vulnerable disproportionately. One quirky detail that almost perfectly encapsulates this is the contrast between the thousands of gallons of valuable porter lost, a quantifiable financial hit for a business, and the unquantified, or at least uncompensated, loss of life, home, and livelihood for the residents of St. Giles. It makes you wonder if there were any satirical prints at the time depicting a giant beer barrel literally crushing the poor while the rich looked on, or perhaps just complained about the smell. Historians still use the London beer flood as a case study to explore urban history, industrial archaeology, and the social history of poverty. It's an event that, because of its sheer oddity, tends to stick in the memory, prompting further questions about the period. What did it really smell like? How long did it take for the neighborhood to truly recover, if it ever fully did from this specific incident, on top of its existing woes? Were there any long term folk memories or local legends that persisted in the St. Giles area, specifically related to the flood, beyond the newspaper accounts and official records? Ultimately, the London beer flood is a story of a city in transition, a snapshot of a moment when old ways of life were colliding with new industrial realities. It's a tale of immense vats and impoverished cellars, of industrial might and human fragility. While the 8 souls who perished are its most direct tragedy, the event also serves as a broader allegory for the often intoxicating, sometimes dangerous, and frequently inequitable brew of progress. The Sudsy streets of 1814 have long since dried, but the story, in all its strange and poignant detail, continues to pour forth lessons for those willing to listen. Now, as our journey through the curious case of the London beer flood concludes, let the images of overflowing vats, inundated streets, and the chaotic aftermath gently recede. The story of this surprisingly sudsy disaster, with its tragic consequences and bizarre circumstances, can now become a distant, fading echo as you prepare for your own peaceful rest. Allow the thought of that overwhelming tide of porter to transform into a gentle, soothing wave of relaxation, washing away the day's cares. The chaotic sounds and pungent smells of 19th century St. Giles can be replaced by the calm and quiet of your own comfortable surroundings. The feeling of being caught in an unexpected deluge can give way to the secure and dry comfort of your bed. Any lingering thoughts about industrial accidents or the plight of the urban poor can now dissolve, no longer needing your attention as you drift towards sleep. The great vats of Moo's Brewery are long gone. Their contents return to the quiet annals of history. There are no more floods to fear, no more cries for help to hear. There is only the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, steady and calm, and the comforting darkness that invites you to let go. The strange, dark tide has ebbed, and in its place, there is only peace. Hey friends, tonight we are venturing deep into the humid lowlands of ancient Mesoamerica to encounter a series of enigmatic and truly colossal stone portraits that have puzzled archaeologists and captivated the imagination for over a century. Imagine stumbling through dense jungle, pushing aside thick vines, and suddenly coming face to face with a multi-ton stone head, taller than you are, with a serene, powerful gaze that seems to have been watching the centuries pass by. That's the kind of monumental mystery we're gently carving into tonight. The Olmec colossal stone heads. You're probably thinking, giant stone heads? Cool, like something out of an adventure movie. And they absolutely are. But let's be honest, if you were tasked with quarrying a 20-ton block of basalt, dragging it 60 miles through swamps and jungles without wheels or draft animals, and then meticulously carving it into a realistic human portrait using only stone tools, you probably wouldn't survive the sheer back-breaking labor, the mosquitoes, or the artistic pressure of getting the royal nose just right. It makes your weekend DIY projects look like child's play. So before you get too comfortable, go ahead and take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're all tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below. Now turn off your lights, turn on your fan for some gentle white noise, and let's begin tonight's journey. You find yourself transported to the tropical lowlands of Mexico's Gulf Coast, in what are now the states of Veracruz and Tabasco. The air is thick with humidity, alive with the sounds of unseen insects and distant birdsong. This is the heartland of a civilization that flourished long before the Maya or the Aztecs, a culture often referred to as the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the Olmec. They thrived roughly between 1400 BCE and 400 BCE, creating vibrant ceremonial centers, developing sophisticated art styles, and laying many of the cultural foundations for the civilizations that would follow. You can imagine their world: dense rainforests, meandering rivers, fertile plains ideal for cultivating maize, beans, and squash. It's a landscape both rich and challenging, and it's here that they created their most iconic and enigmatic monuments, the colossal stone heads. Our modern encounter with these ancient giants begins much later, in 1862. You are with Jose Maria Melgar y Serrano, a Mexican scholar and explorer. He's traveling near a hacienda called Tres Zapotes in Veracruz when local villagers tell him about a curious, partially buried stone object they've encountered while clearing land. Intrigued, Melgar investigates. You can picture the scene: workers digging away at the earth, slowly revealing not just a stone, but a massive, skillfully carved human head, its features distinct, its expression serene, yet imposing. It's unlike anything seen before in the region by European or Mexican scholars. A mainstream historical fact is that Melgar's subsequent publication of his discovery in 1869, though initially met with some skepticism or limited attention, marked the first scholarly notice of these extraordinary Olmec artifacts. He noted its Ethiopian features, sparking early, and now largely dismissed, theories about transoceanic contact. The head itself, now known as Tres Zapotes Monument A, is colossal, standing several feet high and weighing many tons. It's carved from basalt, a hard volcanic rock. Its most striking features are the fleshy, almost baby-faced cheeks, the broad nose, the full lips, and the close-fitting helmet-like headdress that adorns its brow. The eyes are slightly almond-shaped, gazing forward with a calm, powerful intensity. It's clearly a portrait, not a generic representation, imbued with a sense of individual character. You can almost feel the presence of the person it depicts, a ruler perhaps, or a warrior, immortalized in stone. One quirky detail about this first discovered head is that Melgar initially only saw part of it, as it was still mostly buried. It wasn't fully excavated until many decades later, revealing its true scale and the skill of its creators. The sheer effort involved in creating and positioning these heads is staggering to contemplate, especially given the Olmec's technology. They had no metal tools harder than stone, though they did work with jade and other hard minerals. No wheeled vehicles, and no draft animals like horses or oxen. The basalt boulders used for the heads were often quarried many miles away from where the heads were eventually found, sometimes up to 60 or 70 miles in the Tuxtla Mountains. Imagine the immense communal effort required, felling giant trees to create rollers or sledges, hacking paths through dense jungle and swamps, and then slowly, laboriously, dragging these multi-ton monoliths to their designated ceremonial centers, like San Lorenzo or La Venta. Historians and archaeologists still debate the exact methods used for this transportation. Were they moved primarily by land, using manpower and ropes? Or did the Olmecs utilize the extensive river systems, perhaps floating the massive stones on large rafts during flood seasons? It was an undertaking that would have required sophisticated organization, a large labor force, and a profound societal commitment to these monumental projects. The slow, rhythmic chanting of workers, the creak of ropes, the immense strain, all for these serene, colossal faces that would watch over their people for generations. Following that initial discovery by Melgar Y. Serrano at Tres Zapotes, it would take several decades, well into the 20th century, for more of these colossal stone heads to come to light, and for the true extent and antiquity of the Olmec civilization to be appreciated. As archaeologists like Matthew Sterling began systematic excavations at key Olmec sites such as La Venta and San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan in the 1930s and 40s, more of these enigmatic portraits were unearthed, each one a monumental testament to a forgotten world. You can imagine the thrill of each new discovery, another massive stone face emerging from the earth, its features remarkably preserved, despite centuries of burial in the humid tropical environment. To date, 17 of these colossal heads have been confirmed, ranging in height from about 5 feet to over 11 feet, and weighing anywhere from 6 to an estimated 50 tons. You stand before one now, perhaps in the filtered sunlight of a jungle clearing where it was found, or in the hushed atmosphere of a museum. The sheer scale is awe-inspiring. They are all carved from dark, dense basalt, a volcanic rock that would have been incredibly challenging to work with. The Olmecs quarried these massive boulders, as you know, from the Tuxtla Mountains, a considerable distance from their main ceremonial centers. The journey alone was an epic feat. Once the boulder was at the workshop site, you can picture the master carvers and their apprentices beginning their slow, patient work. They had no metal tools harder than stone, so they would have used other stone tools, harder handheld stones, perhaps quartzite or diorite, to peck, grind, and incise the basalt, gradually shaping the features. The process would have taken months, perhaps even years for each head, a testament to incredible skill, patience, and physical endurance. Imagine the constant tapping, the dust, the sweat, as these serene faces slowly emerged from the unyielding rock. While each head is unique, clearly a portrait of an individual, they share a number of distinctive characteristics. Most apparent is the helmet-like headdress that each figure wears. These are not simple caps. They are often elaborate, closely fitting, and adorned with various incised motifs, perhaps symbols of lineage, status, or specific achievements. Some helmets have ear flaps, some have jaguar paw designs, others have net-like patterns, or representations of claws or talons. A mainstream historical fact is that these headdresses are very similar to those depicted on smaller Olmec figurines and are thought to be protective gear, possibly worn by rulers or warriors, or perhaps even by players of the Mesoamerican ball game, a ritual sport of immense importance in Olmec and later cultures. The faces themselves are powerful and memorable, broad with fleshy cheeks, flat noses, and thick, often slightly downturned lips. The eyes are typically almond-shaped, sometimes with incised pupils, giving them a focused, intense gaze. Many of the heads also feature prominent ear spools or ornaments. The major Olmec centers, where these heads have been found, San Lorenzo, La Venta, Tres Zapotes, and the smaller site of Laguna de los Cerros were clearly important places. San Lorenzo, flourishing from around 1400 to 1000 BCE, is where the earliest known heads were created. You can picture it as a thriving ceremonial complex built on a massive earthen platform with elaborate aqueducts and plazas, and of course, these colossal stone portraits strategically placed. La Venta, which rose to prominence after San Lorenzo's decline, roughly 900 to 400 BCE, also featured monumental architecture, including a large earthen pyramid, intricate mosaics, and its own array of colossal heads, often displaying a slightly different stylistic refinement. One quirky detail is that many of the heads, when discovered, were found to have been intentionally buried, or in some cases, even mutilated or defaced before burial. We'll explore the reasons for this later, but it adds another layer of mystery to these already enigmatic monuments. Historians and archaeologists still debate the precise function of these heads and the identity of the individuals they portray. Were they portraits of specific Olmec rulers, each head representing a different king, their stern, watchful gaze overseeing their domain? Or did they represent a more generalized concept of leadership or ideal warriorhood? The individuality of each face strongly suggests they are portraits of actual people, powerful figures who held significant sway in Olmec society. You can feel the authority emanating from these stone visages, a silent but potent declaration of power and identity, carved with immense effort to endure for millennia. The Olmecs may not have had a written script in the way the later Maya did, though they did use some hieroglyphic symbols. But these colossal heads were a powerful form of communication in themselves, broadcasting messages of authority, lineage, and perhaps divine connection across the landscape. After the Olmec civilization gradually declined around 400 BCE, for reasons that are still not entirely clear, perhaps environmental changes, internal strife, or the rise of new regional powers, their magnificent ceremonial centers, like San Lorenzo and La Venta, were slowly reclaimed by the jungle. You can imagine the relentless encroachment of tropical vegetation, the crumbling of earthen pyramids, and the great stone heads, those powerful portraits of Olmec rulers, gradually sinking into the earth or being covered by centuries of accumulated soil and debris. The memory of who the Olmec were and what these colossal heads represented faded from human consciousness. Later Mesoamerican civilizations, like the Maya and the Aztecs, certainly inherited many cultural traits from the Olmecs: their calendar systems, their ball game, their artistic motifs, but the specific identity of the Olmecs as the creators of these giant stone heads seems to have been largely lost to them, or at least not recorded in ways that survived for us to easily understand. For over 2,000 years, these monumental sculptures lay dormant, their serene, powerful faces hidden from the world. It's a vast span of silence, a long interlude in their story. Imagine those centuries passing, empires rising and falling elsewhere in Mesoamerica, the arrival of Europeans, the conquest, the colonial period, and all the while, these colossal Olmec portraits waited patiently beneath the soil of Veracruz and Tabasco. It's a testament to their sheer size and the remoteness of some of their locations that they weren't discovered and perhaps destroyed or repurposed by later cultures unfamiliar with their original significance. A mainstream historical fact is that it wasn't until Jose Maria Melgar y Serrano's encounter with the Tres Zapote's head in 1862, and more significantly, the archaeological expeditions of the early to mid 20th century, that the Olmec civilization and its most iconic artworks began to be truly rediscovered and understood by the modern world. The initial bewilderment of those who first encountered these heads in the 19th and early 20th centuries is understandable. Here were these massive, skillfully carved stone portraits, clearly of great antiquity, yet they didn't fit easily into the known frameworks of Mesoamerican history, which at the time was much more focused on the later Maya and Aztec civilizations. Who were these people with their distinctive facial features and elaborate helmets? How did they create and move such enormous stones without advanced technology? One quirky detail from this period of rediscovery is the proliferation of various speculative and often quite fanciful theories about the Olmec's origins, because some of the heads appeared to have features that some early observers interpreted as South African or Asian. Theories of transoceanic contact with ancient Egypt or migrations from other continents were proposed. These theories, often tinged with the racial biases of the era, have since been largely discredited by modern archaeology and genetic studies, which firmly place the Olmecs as an indigenous Mesoamerican civilization. Historians still debate the exact nature of the Olmec collapse or transformation. Was it a sudden event or a gradual decline and dispersal of population? Did their knowledge and traditions simply morph into those of later cultures, or was there a more definitive break? The intentional burial or mutilation of some of the heads, which occurred even in Olmec times, adds another layer to this mystery, suggesting perhaps internal power struggles, ritual decommissioning of monuments, or conquests by rival groups. You can feel the immense challenge faced by those early 20th century archaeologists sifting through the jungle soil, trying to piece together the story of this foundational culture from its enigmatic art and the remnants of its ceremonial centers. The Olmecs didn't leave extensive written records like the Maya, so their story has had to be reconstructed primarily through their monumental art, their sophisticated pottery, and the layout of their ancient cities. The colossal heads, in their silent, imposing grandeur, were the most dramatic and puzzling clues they left behind, a profound statement from a world that was only just beginning to be understood. The rediscovery of these colossal stone heads, emerging like ancient titans from their earthen slumber, immediately ignited a burning question that continues to intrigue scholars and lay people alike. Who are these stern, imposing figures? You gaze at one of these massive basalt portraits, its features so carefully rendered, the fleshy cheeks, the broad nose, the powerful, slightly downturned mouth, the intense, focused eyes. There's an undeniable individuality to each head. These aren't generic representations of gods or mythical beings. They are clearly meant to be specific people. But who? The most widely accepted theory, and the one with the most compelling evidence, is that these colossal heads are portraits of Olmec rulers, powerful chieftains or kings who held sway over the ceremonial centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta. Imagine the sheer societal effort involved in creating just one of these monuments. Quarrying a multi-ton basalt boulder, transporting it laboriously across miles of difficult terrain, and then meticulously carving it with stone tools over months, perhaps even years. This was not an undertaking to be taken lightly. Such an immense investment of resources and labor strongly suggests that the individuals being depicted were figures of supreme importance, people who could command this level of devotion and manpower. You can almost feel the authority radiating from the stone, a clear statement of power and status. It's like the Olmec version of Mount Rushmore, but instead of presidents, you have these helmeted figures, each one a potent symbol of leadership in their time. A mainstream historical fact is that no two heads are exactly alike. Each possesses distinct facial features and, significantly, a unique and often elaborate headdress, further supporting the idea that they are individual portraits. Those headdresses are a key piece of the puzzle. They are often described as helmet-like, fitting closely to the head, sometimes with ear flaps or chin straps. Many are adorned with incised symbols, perhaps representing lineage, specific titles, personal achievements, or even a connection to particular deities or animal spirits, like the jaguar, which was a powerful motif in Olmec art. You can picture an Olmec ruler, his head adorned with such a distinctive helmet, a clear marker of his rank and authority, perhaps worn during important ceremonies, battles, or while presiding over the sacred ball game. These aren't just hats, they are symbols of power, akin to a king's crown or a general's insignia. It's like their ancient LinkedIn profile picture, but carved in 20 tons of stone. Ruler of La Venta, proficient in maize cultivation and ceremonial oversight, possessor of this very impressive helmet. The placement of these heads within the ceremonial centers also hints at their significance. They were often arranged in specific alignments, perhaps along processional ways or guarding sacred precincts. You can imagine them as awe-inspiring public monuments, constantly reminding the populace of the power and permanence of their rulers, both living and perhaps ancestral. Some heads show signs of being recarved from earlier monuments, possibly other heads or large stone thrones, suggesting a dynastic continuity, or perhaps one ruler asserting his dominance by repurposing the monuments of a predecessor. One quirky detail is that some of the heads have crossed eyes or show other distinct physical traits, further enhancing their individuality and suggesting a commitment to realistic, if stylized, portraiture of actual people. Historians and archaeologists still debate the exact nature of Olmec political structure. Were these rulers hereditary kings passing power down through dynastic lines? Or were they perhaps charismatic leaders who rose to prominence through military prowess, religious authority, or control of trade networks? The colossal heads, as portraits of specific individuals, certainly suggest a system where leadership was personalized and perhaps even glorified. The immense effort required to create them might also indicate a society with a significant degree of social stratification and the ability to mobilize large labor forces, characteristic of a centralized chiefdom or an early state. You can feel the weight of their authority, these stone rulers silently presiding over their domain, their serene yet powerful expressions, a constant reminder of who was in charge in the Olmec heartland, their legacy literally set in stone. While the theory that the colossal heads depict Olmec rulers is the most widely accepted, you can imagine scholars, like patient detectives, turning over every stone, exploring other possibilities that might complement or even challenge this dominant view. The sheer effort and artistry poured into these monuments suggest figures of immense importance, but could that importance have stemmed from roles other than, or in addition to, kingship? You gaze again at those helmeted figures, their expressions powerful and enigmatic. What other identities might they represent? Some scholars have proposed that the heads could depict victorious warriors, their helmets being a clear sign of martial prowess. In a society that was likely establishing and defending territory, or perhaps engaging in ritualized conflict, accomplished warriors who brought glory and security to their people might well have been honored with such monumental portraits. You can almost picture a revered military leader, his face weathered, his gaze steady, immortalized in stone as a guardian and a hero to his community. The helmets, with their varied insignia, could in this interpretation denote different ranks, military achievements, or affiliations with specific warrior societies. Another intriguing possibility, often linked to the distinctive helmets, is that some of the heads might represent champion ball players. A mainstream historical fact is that the Mesoamerican ball game, played with a solid rubber ball, was a deeply significant ritual and sport throughout the region, with roots going back to Olmec times. Players often wore protective gear, including helmets. Given the ritual importance of the game, which sometimes even involved human sacrifice, it's conceivable that celebrated ball players who might have achieved a kind of heroic or even semi-divine status through their prowess could have been commemorated with these colossal sculptures. Imagine a star athlete of the ancient world, his skill on the ball court earning him a permanent place of honor, his stone likeness a testament to his victories and perhaps the favor of the gods. It adds a different kind of dynamism to your perception of these serene faces. Perhaps they weren't just static rulers, but also figures of immense physical skill and ritual power. And here we have Swift Jaguar Paw, MVP of the 1200 BCE Olmec League, famous for his ceremonial hip shot. Beyond who they represent, you ponder the deeper meaning and purpose of these heads. Were they simply portraits intended to glorify individuals? Or did they serve broader ritualistic, symbolic, or even magical functions within Olmec society? Their colossal size and the durable basalt material suggest a desire for permanence, for creating monuments that would endure for generations, perhaps to legitimize dynasties, assert control over territory, or serve as focal points for ancestral veneration. You can imagine them placed in sacred precincts, perhaps as part of larger ceremonial complexes, where rituals were performed to ensure the fertility of the land, the success of harvests, or the continued favor of the gods. The heads, in this sense, might have been seen as conduits to the supernatural world, or as powerful embodiments of the community's connection to its rulers, its ancestors, and its deities. One quirky detail that adds to their mystique is their orientation. Some heads seem to have been deliberately placed to face outwards from ceremonial centers, as if guarding the approaches, while others were arranged in groups or lines, suggesting a narrative or a specific ritual procession. The Olmecs were clearly thinking about how these monuments would be experienced, how they would interact with the landscape and with the people who moved among them. Historians still debate the precise cosmological or ritual significance of these arrangements. Were they aligned with astronomical events? Did they mark sacred pathways or boundaries? Or did their placement reflect a more earthly political geography, delineating the spheres of influence of different rulers or lineages? You can feel the layers of meaning embedded in these stones. They are not just portraits, but complex cultural statements, silent participants in the religious and political life of the Olmec world. Their serene expressions might mask a wealth of symbolic power, their gaze fixed on concerns both earthly and divine. As you continue to contemplate these colossal Olmec heads, your attention is drawn to their distinctive artistic style, a visual language that is both powerful and surprisingly subtle. This isn't just about size, it's about a specific set of aesthetic conventions that define Olmec art and set it apart, even as it lays the groundwork for many of the great art traditions that would follow in Mesoamerica. You can almost feel the hand of the master carver, not just shaping stone, but imbuing it with a particular cultural fingerprint. The faces, as you've noted, are renowned for their fleshy, almost cherubic cheeks and full, often slightly downturned lips, a feature sometimes referred to by art historians as the Olmec frown or even the jaguar snarl, though the expression on the colossal heads tends to be more serene and authoritative than overtly aggressive. The noses are broad and somewhat flattened, and the eyes are typically almond-shaped, often with heavy lids, giving them a contemplative, watchful quality. A mainstream historical fact is that these stylistic features, the particular way of rendering the human face, the characteristic helmet, the powerful, somewhat compact forms, are hallmarks of Olmec art across various media, from these giant stone heads to smaller jade figurines and ceramic pieces. This consistency across different scales and materials speaks to a well-established artistic tradition and a shared set of cultural symbols. The choice of material, basalt, is significant in itself. This hard, dark volcanic stone is incredibly durable, capable of withstanding the ravages of time and the humid tropical environment far better than softer stones or wood. You can imagine the Olmecs deliberately selecting basalt for its permanence, intending these portraits of their rulers or revered figures to endure for eternity, a lasting testament to their power and legacy. The fact that these massive basalt boulders often had to be transported with immense effort from distant quarries in the Tuxtla Mountains only adds to their prestige. It was a demonstration of the ruler's ability to command resources and mobilize vast amounts of labor, a conspicuous display of power, literally set in stone. The smooth, sometimes almost polished, finish achieved on such a hard material, using only stone tools, is a testament to the incredible skill and patience of Olmec artisans. It's like they were coaxing these serene faces out of the unyielding rock through sheer willpower and generations of accumulated craft knowledge. The influence of this Olmec artistic style on later Mesoamerican civilizations is profound and widely recognized by archaeologists. You can see echoes of Olmec motifs, iconography, and aesthetic sensibilities in the art of the Maya, the Teotihuacanos, the Zapotecs, and even the later Aztecs. Concepts like the importance of the jaguar deity, certain ceremonial practices, like the ball game, and particular ways of representing human and supernatural figures seem to have their roots in Olmec culture. One quirky detail is the were-jaguar motif, common in Olmec art, a creature combining human and jaguar features, often with a distinctive downturned mouth and almond-shaped eyes, which reappears in various forms in later cultures, suggesting the enduring power of Olmec religious ideas. It's like the Olmecs created the original artistic and symbolic playbook for Mesoamerica, and subsequent civilizations riffed on their themes for centuries. Oh, you're carving a feathered serpent? Nice. We Olmecs were into were-jaguars when your ancestors were still figuring out basic pottery. Just saying. Historians still debate the exact mechanisms by which this Olmec influence spread. Was it through direct conquest or colonization, though there's limited evidence for a large Olmec empire? Or was it primarily through trade networks, intermarriage between elites, and the diffusion of religious ideas and prestige goods? The Olmec heartland, with its fertile river systems and access to coastal trade routes, was well positioned to be a cultural crossroads. Regardless of the precise means, their artistic and cultural innovations, so powerfully embodied in these colossal stone heads, left an indelible mark on the civilizations that followed. You can feel the weight of that legacy, these serene stone faces, not just portraits of long-dead rulers, but also the progenitors of an artistic tradition that would define a continent for millennia. They are the stoic, silent grandparents of Mesoamerican art. As you delve deeper into the mystery of the Olmec colossal heads, you encounter one of their most puzzling and debated aspects: the evidence that many of them were intentionally damaged or mutilated and then deliberately buried, often in carefully arranged patterns. This isn't the random wear and tear of centuries of exposure. You see clear signs of human action, pockmarks from deliberate hammering, areas where features like noses or lips have been flattened or broken, or grooves incised across the face. You can imagine the scene: a once revered colossal portrait, perhaps after years or generations of display, being subjected to this intentional defacement before being committed to the earth. It raises a host of questions about Olmec beliefs, political dynamics, and the ultimate fate of these monumental sculptures within their own culture. What could have motivated such actions? One prominent theory is that this mutilation was a form of ritual killing or decommissioning of the monument, perhaps occurring after the death of the ruler it represented. You can picture a solemn ceremony where the power or spirits believed to reside within the stone portrait was ritually neutralized before the head was respectfully interred. In this view, the damage wasn't necessarily an act of disrespect, but a necessary step in transitioning the monument from the world of the living to the realm of the ancestors, or to prevent its potent spiritual energy from becoming uncontrolled or dangerous after its subject had passed. It's like an ancient, very permanent, powering down sequence. Another, more dramatic possibility is iconoclasm, the deliberate destruction of images for political or religious reasons. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the Olmec centers, like San Lorenzo, show evidence of internal conflict or invasion around the time of their decline. Perhaps these colossal heads, as potent symbols of the ruling elite, were targeted by internal rebels seeking to overthrow the existing order, or by external conquerors aiming to erase the symbols of the previous regime and assert their own dominance. You can imagine the fury and assertiveness of such acts, a new power literally defacing the old. If this is the case, the damage would be a clear message of political upheaval and a break with the past. The old king is gone, and so is his big stone face. New management in town. A third perspective suggests that some of the damage might have occurred not out of malice, but as part of a process of recycling or reshaping the stone. Basalt was a precious and hard to obtain resource. It's possible that some older, damaged, or no longer relevant heads were intended to be recarved into new monuments, perhaps smaller heads, thrones. Many Olmec thrones were also monumental stone carvings, or other sculptures. The initial stages of reshaping such a massive block might involve roughing out or breaking off sections, which could appear as mutilation to later observers. One quirky detail that lends some credence to this idea is that some Olmec monuments, including some of the smaller heads or thrones, do indeed show signs of having been reworked from earlier pieces. However, for the truly colossal heads, the effort involved in significantly reshaping them might have been prohibitive. Historians and archaeologists still vigorously debate these various interpretations, and it's quite possible that different heads were damaged and buried for different reasons at different times. Was the burial always accompanied by defacement, or were some heads buried intact as a form of reverential offering or to protect them during times of trouble? The context of the burials themselves sometimes offers clues. Some heads are found neatly aligned, while others seem to have been more haphazardly interred. You can feel the complexity here, the difficulty of interpreting actions from so long ago without written records to explain the intent. These acts of mutilation and burial add another layer of profound mystery to the Olmec heads, suggesting a dynamic and sometimes turbulent relationship between these people and their most potent symbols of power. They weren't just static monuments, they were active participants in the ongoing drama of Olmec history, their stone faces witnessing not only reverence, but also, perhaps, revolution and ritual transformation. The serene expressions on the heads give no easy answers to the violence some of them clearly endured before their long sleep in the earth. The story of the Olmec colossal heads doesn't end with those initial, dramatic discoveries in the 19th and early 20th centuries. As archaeological exploration of the Olmec heartland continued, more of these enigmatic stone giants were brought to light, each discovery adding another piece to the complex puzzle of this ancient civilization. You can imagine the ongoing excitement in the field, the patient work of archaeologists and local teams, sometimes guided by local knowledge or accidental finds, revealing these monumental portraits one by one from their centuries-long slumber. To date, as you know, 17 of these colossal heads have been definitively identified, unearthed primarily from the 4 major Olmec centers: San Lorenzo, La Venta, Tres Zapotes, and the smaller site of Laguna de los Cerros. San Lorenzo, one of the earliest Olmec centers, has yielded the largest number, 10 heads in total. You can picture this site in its heyday, around 1200 BCE, a bustling ceremonial complex with its great earthen platform, sophisticated drainage systems, and these imposing stone portraits strategically placed, perhaps gazing out over plazas or along important causeways. La Venta, which rose to prominence after San Lorenzo's decline, is home to 4 magnificent heads, each with its own distinct character, continuing the tradition of monumental ruler portraiture. Tres Zapotes, where the very first head was reported by Melgar y Serrano, has given us two, and Laguna de los Cheros, another important but less extensively excavated site, one. Each head, while sharing common Olmec stylistic traits, is a unique individual. Their subtle differences in facial features and helmet design hinting at a succession of powerful leaders or distinct regional styles. A mainstream historical fact is that the careful mapping of where these heads were found, their association with other monuments, like thrones or altars, and their relationship to ceremonial architecture provides crucial clues about Olmec urban planning, ritual practices, and political organization. Despite over a century of research since that first discovery, the Olmecs and their colossal heads still hold many secrets. You can feel the allure of these ongoing mysteries, the questions that continue to drive archaeologists and historians. For instance, while the heads are generally accepted as portraits of rulers, the exact nature of Olmec kingship and political power remains a subject of much discussion. Were these divine kings intermediaries between the human and supernatural worlds? Or were they more akin to powerful chieftains, their authority based on lineage, military prowess, and control of resources? The Olmecs left no extensive written texts that we can decipher in the way we can with later Maya hieroglyphs, though they did use an early form of Mesoamerican writing and calendrical systems. So much of our understanding must be inferred from their art, their architecture, and the patterns of their settlements. It's like trying to read a fascinating book where most of the pages are missing, and you have to reconstruct the story from the illustrations and the chapter titles. Chapter 3. The guy with the really big helmet and the jaguar cape. He seems important. The reasons for the decline of the major Olmec centers, particularly San Lorenzo around 900 BCE and La Venta around 400 BCE, are also still debated. Was it environmental change, such as the silting up of rivers or volcanic activity, that disrupted their agricultural base? Or was it internal social unrest, rebellions against the ruling elite, perhaps evidenced by the deliberate mutilation and burial of some of the colossal heads? Or did external conflicts with neighboring groups lead to their downfall? It was likely a combination of factors, a slow transformation rather than a sudden collapse. One quirky detail is that even after the decline of their major centers, Olmec cultural influence continued to resonate throughout Mesoamerica for centuries, a testament to the power and prestige of their innovations in art, religion, and societal organization. Historians still debate the full extent and nature of this Olmec influence. How were their ideas and artistic styles transmitted to other cultures? Was it through trade networks, migration, or religious proselytizing, or even conquest? The Olmecs are often called the mother culture, but this term itself is sometimes debated. Were they a single unified civilization that directly birthed all later Mesoamerican cultures, or one among several important early formative cultures whose interactions created the rich tapestry of ancient Mesoamerica? You can feel the ongoing intellectual excitement as new discoveries and new analytical techniques continue to refine our understanding of this foundational civilization and their most iconic creations. The colossal heads, in their serene, stoic silence, still have much to tell us, their stone lips holding the secrets of a world that is slowly, piece by piece, being brought back into the light. The journey of understanding the Olmec colossal heads continues into our modern era, aided by an ever expanding toolkit of scientific techniques and a global scholarly effort. You can imagine archaeologists today no longer just relying on visual inspection and excavation context, but employing sophisticated methods to wrest further secrets from these ancient stones. Geologists, for example, conduct petrographic and geochemical analysis on the basalt itself. By carefully studying the mineral composition and chemical fingerprint of the stone, they can trace the origin of the boulders with remarkable precision back to specific volcanic sources in the Tuxtla Mountains. A mainstream historical fact is that this sourcing work has confirmed the incredible distances, sometimes over 60 miles, that the Olmecs transported these multi-ton monoliths, providing concrete evidence of their engineering prowess and organizational capabilities. It's like ancient geological forensics, matching the fingerprint of the head to the fingerprint of the quarry. The preservation and display of these colossal heads also present unique challenges. These are not small, delicate artifacts that can be easily housed in a climate-controlled case, though some smaller Olmec pieces are. They are massive, weighing many tons. For those still located at or near their original sites, like in the Parque Museo La Venta in Villahermosa, Tabasco, which is an open-air museum designed to evoke their original jungle setting, they are exposed to the tropical climate, the humidity, the rain, the fluctuating temperatures, which can take a slow toll on the stone over centuries. You can picture conservators carefully monitoring their condition, perhaps applying protective treatments and working to mitigate environmental damage. For those housed in indoor museums, like the magnificent examples in the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City, the challenge is one of structural support, safe transportation if they ever need to be moved, and creating displays that do justice to their monumental scale and cultural significance. One quirky detail is simply the logistics of moving a 20-ton stone head even within a museum. It requires specialized heavy lifting equipment, careful planning, and probably a collective holding of breath from everyone involved. It's not like you can just ask a couple of interns to carry it up the stairs. Okay, team, on 3, 1, 2, and oh, watch the priceless pre-Columbian artifact, Johnson. These colossal heads have become potent symbols of ancient Mesoamerican heritage and a source of immense cultural pride, particularly in Mexico. They are instantly recognizable icons, featured in art, literature, and popular culture, representing one of the oldest and most foundational civilizations of the Americas. You can see their influence in modern Mexican art and design, a nod to this deep ancestral past. Their serene, powerful faces gaze out at us across the millennia, a tangible link to a world that, while vastly different from our own, laid many of the cultural cornerstones for the civilizations that followed. Historians and archaeologists continue to debate and refine our understanding of the Olmecs through the study of these heads and other related artifacts. For example, what was the exact nature of their religious beliefs? We see evidence of a complex cosmology with deities that often combined human and animal features, like the were-jaguar, but the full pantheon and the nuances of their ritual practices are still being pieced together. The precise meaning of the symbols on the helmets of the colossal heads remains a rich area for research. Do they represent specific lineages, place names, astronomical events, or mythical beings? Each new interpretation adds another layer to our appreciation of Olmec intellectual and artistic sophistication. You can feel the ongoing dialogue with these ancient stones, a conversation that spans centuries, driven by human curiosity and the enduring power of these monumental portraits to evoke wonder and inspire questions. They are not just artifacts, they are silent interlocutors from a distant past, challenging us to keep searching for the full story of the people who carved them. As our journey with the Olmec colossal heads draws to a close, you're left with a sense of profound admiration for this ancient civilization and a lingering fascination with the many mysteries that still surround them. These serene, powerful stone faces are their most iconic legacy, a silent but eloquent testament to their artistry, their social organization, and their worldview. Yet for all we've learned from them and the archaeological sites where they were found, the Olmecs themselves remain a somewhat enigmatic people, their origins and their ultimate fate still cloaked in the mists of time. The decline of the great Olmec centers, San Lorenzo around 900 BCE and La Venta around 400 BCOE, marks the end of their cultural fluorescence. But what exactly happened? You can imagine various scenarios. Environmental pressures, such as changes in river courses or volcanic eruptions that affected their agricultural lands, internal conflicts or rebellions, perhaps hinted at by the mutilation and burial of some of their monuments, or the rise of new competing centers of power in other parts of Mesoamerica. A mainstream historical fact is that there wasn't a single, sudden collapse, but rather a gradual transformation and dispersal of Olmec populations and cultural traits over several centuries. Their influence didn't simply vanish, it was absorbed and reinterpreted by the successor cultures that rose in the region. What became of the Olmec people themselves? They didn't just disappear. Their descendants likely merged with other groups, contributing to the rich genetic and cultural mix of later Mesoamerican populations. You can almost see their legacy as a powerful river that flows into a larger ocean, its distinct currents eventually blending with others, but still shaping the overall character of the waters. The Olmecs laid a foundation, and upon that foundation, other great civilizations like the Maya and the Teotihuacanos would build. One quirky detail that highlights this continuity is the persistence of certain Olmec artistic motifs, religious concepts, like the feathered serpent, which may have Olmec roots, and calendrical knowledge in these later cultures, even long after the Olmec heartland had faded from prominence. It's like a cultural DNA, passed down through generations. Oh, that complex calendar system the Maya are famous for? Yeah, our Olmec ancestors were working on the beta version while you were still carving simple stick figures. No big deal. Historians and archaeologists continue to grapple with the full measure of the Olmec achievement. Because they lacked a fully developed narrative script like the Maya, or at least one that has been extensively deciphered, much of their history and belief system must be reconstructed through the painstaking analysis of their art, their monumental architecture, and the patterns of their material culture. The colossal heads in this context are invaluable, albeit silent, historical documents. They speak of powerful rulers, of sophisticated craftsmanship, of a society capable of mobilizing immense resources for monumental undertakings. They are the Olmec's most enduring and globally recognized signature. The 17 known colossal heads, gazing out from their museum displays or their original jungle settings, remain a profound symbol of human ingenuity and the enduring power of art to transcend time. They challenge our perceptions of primitive societies, revealing a level of artistic skill, engineering capability, and social organization that was truly remarkable for its era. You feel a sense of connection to those ancient carvers, to the rulers whose portraits they immortalized, and to a civilization that, while long gone, continues to speak to us through these magnificent stone visages. They are a reminder that great achievements can arise from any culture at any time, and that the desire to leave a lasting mark on the world, to be remembered, is a deeply human one. The Olmecs, through these colossal heads, certainly achieved that. Now, as our contemplation of these ancient stone giants concludes, let the images of serene, helmeted faces and the humid jungles of Mesoamerica gently recede from your thoughts. The story of the Olmecs and their colossal heads, with their mysteries and their silent power, can now become a peaceful, distant echo as you prepare for your own journey into rest. Allow the weight of those multi-ton stones to transform into a sense of deep, grounded relaxation. The patient, meticulous work of the Olmec carvers can become a metaphor for the slow, gentle unwinding of your own mind, letting go of the day's concerns. The enigmatic gaze of the colossal heads, which have watched over centuries of change, can now become a symbol of the peaceful stillness that surrounds you. Any lingering questions about their precise meaning or the fate of the Olmec civilization can drift away, unimportant for this moment of tranquility. There are no more ancient boulders to move, no more intricate symbols to decipher. There is only the gentle rhythm of your breathing, steady and calm, and the comforting darkness that invites you to let go. The silent power of these ancient monuments can now infuse your own sense of peace as you drift effortlessly into a deep and restorative slumber. Good night.